Hello, everyone. This is Jamie Flinchball, host of People Solve Problems, and today we have a guest with us, Chris White. It just goes by Chris White. Chris, how you doing?
Hey, I'm doing fantastic. How are you doing today, Jamie?
I'm doing great. So looking forward to this conversation. You are the co-founder and CEO of scmBLOX's
Yeah.
uh, supply chain management. You've been a systems dynamics modeler for 30 years,
Yep.
covering range of different aspects from operations and supply chains, Lean Sensei, Six Sigma Master Black Belt, and use modeling and simulation to help, guide those
Yeah.
improvement efforts. So we've tread a lot of the same ground,
Yes, indeed.
and that's fun. So let me start with this. This is something that's, I don't want to say a hot button for me, but it's something I have an opinion on. But I want to start with, what's your take, or how do you explain the difference between systems dynamics and systems thinking?
That's a great question, and it all kind of started. If y'all can see, I'm holding the book, The Fifth Discipline by Peter Senge, back in 1990, and that's really when the systems thinking. There have been plenty of systems thinking, or I'll say systems oriented discussions before, but that kind of really kicked off the systems thinking. But and people walked away from that book with all these tenets or principles or whatever of systems thinking. You can't have your cake and eat it too, or you can have your cake and eat it too, just at different times, things like that. However, people forget that Peter Senge was one of the best system dynamicists and a student of Jay Forrester, who invented system dynamics. And so everything that Peter had put together and gleaned from system dynamics to sort of put in more bite-sized chunks became systems thinking. And so when you there is this element of systems orientation and systems thinking, but when, in my opinion, I'll say, when it comes to really trying to solve problems, you got to get into the system dynamics modeling and simulation, because the systems thinking aspect of it is really just more guidance than anything. And a system is a collection of a lot of different parts. So pay attention. Well, yeah, there's some value in that, but for me, it only goes so far. Obviously, we develop system dynamics based software. And so I'm very much more toward the system dynamics end of getting into the modeling and simulation.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I think, kind of an analogy for me is a lot of people will appreciate the use of data in decision making, but somebody has to do all the math to generate that.
Yeah, that's a
And
great analogy.
and the
Yeah.
math matters, right? So
Yeah.
valuing systems thinking, and we're not going to make this about the lean world, but a lot in the lean thinking world will say systems thinking and use the words. But
Hmm.
systems dynamics is just a different aspects of in the detail, in the weeds,
Yeah.
and in particular understand some of the blind spots that don't come up until you actually do the modeling. So
Yeah, if I can throw something
yeah.
else in there, what's interesting is there's something sort of in between that comes from the world of system dynamics called causal loop diagrams, CLDs. I've written a book and I call them consequence maps just because that seems to resonate a little better. People talk about intended consequences and unintended consequences, so I call it consequence mapping, but it's the same thing. It's causal loop diagrams. And that's usually a stepping stone between understanding the problem and diagramming that. And then that becomes an input to creating a system dynamic simulation. So there is something that has some value in between that's a little more rigorous than just systems thinking as an idea or a concept, and begins to put a logical structure around some problem, understanding the feedback loops in the system dynamics world, the structure that we care about that drives the system. And so I just want to say, in between those two worlds, there is this causal loop diagram consequence map layer that is often used just by itself and can be educational and insightful by itself, but it takes you a little bit past the system thinking, but it's not quite the system dynamics.
Yeah, it's great for people that want to get into this and start to explore it more. Uh,
Yeah.
so let's take that into the world of problem solving. You consider systems dynamics its own sort of problem solving discipline, or is it part of a problem solving thinking where, that's where you understand cause and effect, or you start to test
Yeah.
ideas and theories? So is it a skill set wrapped, where problem solving wrapped around it? or is it a separate problem-solving discipline? How do those two interact?
To me, it's really another tool in a toolbox kind of approach. So there are plenty of problems out there and plenty of issues that we want to address. And as much as I'm an advocate for system dynamics is not the best approach to understanding or solving that problem. I think it is good for larger, call them big picture, interconnected. I want to see the system view. But when I'm down to the individual parts or of a system, if we kind of just broadly, let me start, you'll hear me use parts and relations. A system is a collection of parts that are interrelated, interconnected, that all perform a function to achieve a goal or an objective, something like that, all working together. So you might hear me say parts and relations a lot. I'd say that in the book, and I often emphasize that. But in the world of systems, the more complex the system, the relations begin to dominate. That's when you want an approach like system dynamics that cares about the relationships and cares about those feedback loops. When I care only about this part, this singular part, not even all these other parts that are in the system, but this singular part, there are other methods, say discrete event simulation, there are other methods that are better designed and better the purpose of them, the whole technological approach that they use, the mathematics that they use is geared towards understanding more details about that. System dynamics is not designed to do that, but it is designed to look at the larger problem and when we talk supply chains as a system.
Yeah, great. So let's talk about a system that you're focused on, supply chains and supply chain management. There's a lot of places that this can apply, right?
Yeah.
Jay Forrester really was trying to model the whole economy as an
Yeah.
example. Um, why is it particularly useful? Why is this discipline particularly useful for supply chain management in general?
In my opinion, again, start there. And the reason we push so much for system dynamics and using that approach is that up till now, the focus, when you hear supply chain and someone uses the term end-to-end supply chain, if you think about to when you go look again, this is the terminology that's typically used. It's not terminology that I use, but when they say end to end, what it is well, I'm going to track an order from a customer that turns into a purchase order from one of my suppliers, a tier one supplier, and I'm going to track that order going to either my incoming warehouse or my distribution center, and it eventually gets to the customer. It's delivered, and now I invoice and I get paid, and that's sort of end to end. That to me is very limited because it stops at I've highlighted tier one. Tier one. Well, we saw with COVID, that's what really introduced and got everybody talking disruptions and bullwhip effect and the toilet. You saw it with toilet paper and personal protection equipment, all sorts of pieces of equipment and elements, and supply chain management disruptions. Those were on the news. Everyone was using that terminology. Never before had that happened. So COVID was a real eye opener for the supply chain world to understand how interconnected we are. And so these tools and these approaches that only look from my supplier on are limited because there's a lot that happens before your supplier. And if you order from 100 from your supplier, well, their supplier has to give them 100, and their supplier before that has to give 100. There's a lot that has to happen. And many people are familiar probably with what's called the beer game that came out of the world of system dynamics. And that teaches that lesson of that interconnectivity, the supply chain as a system, and that if you take that view, you actually have more power in changing the future. And so I like to use the analogy of a tree. A tree's growing, a tree has a trunk, it's got major branches, kind of smaller branches, and then the leaves out here. And what good is it to optimize the leaves out here when I should have been on this other branch strategically to begin with anyway? And so it's just different tools for different jobs, but it's this realization now that we've got to look at supply chains to understand how disruptions impact, how delays, how resilient they are. And resilience is more of a system phenomenon, not just an individual. Yeah, an individual company can be resilient, but what you want is that supply chain as a system to be resilient. So it kind of broadens that view to system dynamics.
Yeah. So let's talk about sort of that news cycle and how it fits into what we need to do going forward with supply chains. So a lot of emphasis was put on putting a shock into the system. And
Hmm.
I'd actually argue some of the awareness began when the Suez Canal was blocked
Yeah.
as a first shock to the system. And then, ports closing,
Red Sea. Yeah. All those. Yeah.
everything with COVID. So, does it need to be a dramatic shock to the system, or are there other ways in which we're missing opportunities by not understanding the system?
So I'll go back to the fifth discipline and the systems thinking. There's the parable of the boiling frog. That what we're not good at, if as that parable goes, you put a frog in cold water and you start boiling that water. Even as that water gets hot, the frog doesn't jump out. But had I taken a frog and thrown it in hot water to begin with, it would jump out immediately. So what we're not as humans, what we're not good at is seeing these subtle changes that we don't recognize them until they become extreme, and that's when we react. So what you're talking about are some extreme events happen, and now we see this play out. There's a lot before that happens where we can understand how systems operate, and we could understand the vulnerability of, wow, we send everything. Let's just keep with your Suez Canal example. We send everything through the Suez Canal. Let's think about that. What benefit could there be to have suppliers elsewhere or have other trade routes other than just that one? And so then it becomes very apparent when an obvious thing like that happens. But you can begin now, and I think there's this shift to kind of picking our head up and seeing the forest for the trees, of looking at things strategically in longer term to make sure we're better positioned for when these situations happen. And then these extreme events are not as extreme or don't have as near the impact that they could.
Yeah. In your experience working with clients around some of those shocks and disruptions and sort of dynamics that get out of control, some of them are very they're the global system, right? The longshoremen strike, the Suez
Mhm.
Canal, those types of things. And so, they just happen and we have to be resilient against them. So we want to
Right.
understand that. In other cases, they're very acute. It's my supplier is
Mhm.
behind. There was a fire somewhere,
Right.
shipment was lost. And so it's not a global system, it's our system. And
Right.
so, how much of finding the opportunity is on those seemingly smaller but still impactful to me supply chain disruptions versus these, global events?
To me, I'm sort of agnostic. They're the same. They can have the same impact. So you can have some global events that really disrupt you based on the way you're structured, based on where your suppliers are, based on your trade routes and things like that. There are the ones that are very acute where my first tier supplier that's one state over here in the United States has gone bankrupt and didn't give us any indication or whatever, and all of a sudden we're having trouble. Those when we look at modeling these in tools like scmBLOX, those are all equivalent. And more what we do is look around to say, because it's just a digital twin model, you can run hundreds of simulations, right? And you can do the scientific, design of experiments approach of holding all variables constant and only changing one and making it a little, make it a lot, and you check all this, and so you can sort of stress test the supply chain and understand even before you hit these situations, you can understand this is a vulnerable part of my supply chain. It's very fragile. Just a small change can have a huge impact on me. This other part of the supply chain is actually fairly stable. I can have some big swings and nothing really happens to me. And so you can learn that, and you can learn sort of the physics of supply chains that, yeah, there's some benefit in a long supply chain, but there's some disadvantages also. You have all these buffer inventories, and if a disruption happens far away, I'm less impacted because everyone in between me is making accommodations. And by the time it gets to me, it's not that bad. You have things where, well, if I hold buffer inventory, I could actually hurt everyone upstream me because I'm ordering more or trying to keep more than what the true demand is. And so there's a lot that comes to play. And so from my point of view, there's not much of a difference. You can have although it's not, the close ones are acute, and that's part, I think, of this change in philosophy or change in view is we're not as myopic now, and we're realizing there are others. Because before, all I would react to is a problem with my immediate supplier, but now I'm beginning to see there are other things happening, and I need to kind of lift my head up, just like you're driving down the road. I look close to me, but every once in a while I'm looking ahead and keeping an eye on the road up ahead and see what's happening. So they can both be bad. They can both be bad.
Yeah. So thinking about, again, using this as a tool to look at your supply chain, the first step is to build the model, right?
Hmm.
And I kind of relate this to building a process map around a process. It's very common when we would say do a Kaizen event and build a process map that
Yeah.
the ahas would come about just by seeing what actually happens, right? So
Hmm.
before you even get to modeling and improvements, you get ahas because you see it up in lights essentially.
Yeah.
I'll say, do you get that same reaction in building models of supply chains? And what are the biggest surprises people find once they sort of see their supply chain laid out in a
Yeah.
in a model?
Well, one of the biggest surprises is one of the benefits of the system dynamics approach is it's more concerned about structure than data. And in any model, you've kind of let me start with statistical models. They are more data oriented. They rely on data. The model itself is based on data. So all your AI, your machine learning, demand forecasting, best fit, correlation, regression, all that kind of stuff requires data because the model itself is built on data. System dynamics is a cause and effect connection model. So those causal connections are there, whether I'm sitting at 100 or 200 or 500, and you're more looking at relative differences. And so one of the biggest surprises when we work with clients is that they don't need a lot of data. They don't need all this data that they think they do. I got to know exactly the capacity or how much inventory all my suppliers are holding. You don't. You can actually start with, if you know what you're making and you kind of have a bill of material, 9 times out of 10, the supply chain pretty much mirrors the bill of material thing that you're making. And so if you got this real complex, got one thing made up of three things, you probably have a supplier that gives you the one thing and they have three suppliers making up three things. So people think that supply chain visibility is difficult, and they're kind of surprised to find out, wow, we can actually do a lot without getting a lot of data. And in fact, even use the tool to help us understand, hey, here at this, with this one supplier, if the data is 5% higher, it makes a big difference. So let's go get that data. But over here, data could change by 50% and it doesn't really have an impact. Let's not waste time and money to go do that. So it can actually help direct where to go get data.
Yeah, that's a pretty big mindset shift for, I think, supply chain people to
Hmm.
go from, I want all the data to
Exactly.
to focusing on structure. So that's a big mental model shift for a lot of folks. Um, Coming to, we're kind of running out of time, and I want to
Yeah.
make sure we cover this. Thinking about another mindset shift is I wrote an article for Industry Week last year that I kind of argued for the last 40 years, supply chain has been mostly about optimization, cost down,
Yes. Yep.
optimization, and this is now the era of supply chain risk management.
Yep.
Um, are you seeing that same shift? And B,
Yes.
are people understanding risk differently, or how are they understanding risk differently by seeing it in a systems dynamics model?
Yes, I agree that that is happening. And if you think of when you say risk, another term that's often used a lot right now is resilience, the resilience of the supply chain. And that efficiency and resilience are two ends of a spectrum. And that's one thing, we have to learn. And so part of what we're doing is educating executives on this concept that you can't be highly optimal and highly resilient. Those don't exist together. You can be somewhat optimal and somewhat resilient, or you can kind of, move one way or the other. There is no, the two extremes cannot coexist. And we've been at this optimization extreme. I agree with you completely. And that has caused problems. Everyone's been focused on just themselves, meaning their companies and their small part of the supply chain, just their selves, optimizing that. And we've all heard that, optimizing the parts of a system, suboptimize the whole. And that's what we're talking about here. So what we're trying to do is get a better appreciation. And it's not that we necessarily want we care that the whole supply chain as a system runs better, but what we're trying to show is decisions you're making, company, in trying in your best interest, you're actually creating these effects that will come back to bite you later on. And what you thought was really great in the short term actually bites you in the long term.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing your insights. I always love to talk of systems dynamics, and
Yeah.
I wish we had more conversations out there about this. I think it's still a lot of untapped potential, and I wish in supply chain terms or in systems dynamics terms, I wish you and your team all the most productive reinforcing and balancing loops you can handle. And thanks for coming on the show.
You bet. Thanks so much for having me, Jamie. Thank you.